this work session to order, and we're going to start out with a report from the Citizens Utility Advisory Board. Peter Passerelli.
Good evening, Mayor Gamba and council members. This afternoon I have with me Jacob Stetson from the CUAB as well. The other council or CAB members weren't able to quite get here for this time. What we'd like to do is a little bit is talk about what we've been working on and what we're working on this current year. We talked a little bit about it at the Budget Committee last February, the Joint Budget Committee CUAB meeting. So I wanted to just talk a little bit more about what we're doing. So we've been working on reviewing our utility funds. Specifically, over the last several months, we've been focused on our water and wastewater rates and those utilities, looking at the stability of each fund, the financial projections for those funds, and then looking at the rates and developing a presentation that we'll hear a little bit later this afternoon about the recommendations for those utilities.
For what? I'm sorry.
For the water and the wastewater utilities. Thank you.
So did I guess I thought we were undergoing a bigger capital, like the master planning update. So we're not just doing rates. Is that true?
That's a separate, separate piece as well.
Okay.
So.
And it's the same two utilities.
Same two utilities, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So I was a little surprised by the rates ahead of the master plan, but I guess, I mean, we have to have a rate structure for the coming year. But I mean, won't you have to revisit rates after the master plan and the capital improvement plan?
Well, we'll have to revisit those rates after we develop that master plan, and if we adopt those recommendations, making sure that we've got that rate structure put in place to do that.
Okay.
In general, though, looking at both of those utilities, I think we're in, and we'll hear a little bit more about this later this afternoon, that we're really in good financial shape on both of those rates. The projected the recommendations in terms of increases for water for the next 2 years were at 0, and for the wastewater we're roughly 2.5% over the next 2 years as well. We've met, the CUAB's met, we've gone over had a couple presentations. We've made some revisions to the document as we got additional information from Wes on the wastewater side in terms of their future treatment costs. They're projecting right now over the next, I think 10 years, 5% increases into the future for their treatment costs. So we incorporated those costs as well into the assumptions that we made in the rate studies. So we've captured that bit of information. So the utility master plan pieces, so those further documents right now, I can talk a little bit about those. So we've just signed a contract with Tetra Tech to do the water master plan. We're going to have a kickoff meeting here in the next few weeks with them to start the work on that. We've just gone through the consultant selection phase for the wastewater master plan, and we are working on negotiating that fee with that consultant, and then we'll bring that package to City Council. We're shooting for the 19th, I think, of this month to have that ready. We're getting started on that water and the wastewater ones real shortly here.
Those take like a year to do, right?
Those take a year in some cases 18 months, okay, depending on what we do. So there's some flow monitoring that we want to do on the wastewater side to take a look at our infiltration and inflow components of the system. So we want to make sure that we get some good data for that to make sure we can make good assumptions. Wes is looking for us to, in the future, reduce infiltration and inflow in our system. So that'll be part of that master plan study, identifying projects. You know, we've done a lot of work associated with clay pipe replacement that have removed some pipes that were problematic. We still have, I think, the Waverly subdivision that's got clay pipes that we have a big project that we need to do there. Those are already, that's a project that's already in the rate structure. So we're working down that way. And then beginning in the fall, working with the engineering staff, we'll begin reviewing the next, any adjustments to the capital improvement plan that we need to identify to include in the next year's budget cycle. And then tomorrow night we actually have a meeting, and we'll be talking and looking at the stormwater utility rate as well. So I think last year the stormwater fee was increased by 14% based on the recommendations in the stormwater master plan. So we'll be reviewing that utility as well. Jacob, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add? Or?
No, not at this time. You captured, I think, everything that we and the board are looking at. Those recommendations on the rate adjustments are comprehensive. Yeah, sure. No, the rate adjustments I think are fair and in line with projected plans, but when the master plan comes back out, we're going to look at them again.
And so the well, I mean, we're going to get into that more, I guess, but how does the 2.5% work with Wes saying 5%?
Well, we looked at those financial projections and looked at those what does it mean? And Dan, when he gets up here, he'll be able to cover that a little bit more in terms of what that meant. Okay. It just makes some adjustments to the cash balances and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I don't know if anybody has any questions about the CUAB or.
Undoubtedly, there will be some after the next presentation.
Sure.
Is this where you might want to put in your pitch for the, Wes is going to be talking about SDCs. Wes did talk about SDCs at the last CUAB meeting, and they're talking about it on their advisory committee that Kathy went to, and it might be, this is our opportunity to have the conversation about differentiating SDCs based on size of.
How much control does CUAB have over our SDCs?
Well, I think it's just reviewing to make sure that they're appropriate, and then it comes to council for approval. But I think they're adjusted based off of the construction cost index. I was thinking in the master fee.
It's a crazy complicated system that.
It's an actual. We've hired consultants in the past, and I'm not sure if those have gone through this UAB.
I wasn't remembering that they
on the wastewater master plan. That's part of that.
It's a part of the study.
Part of that process.
Part of that study.
That SDC methodology.
And we had a meeting. This was before Chuck left, I believe, with Ann and Chuck and Kelly and Denny talking about SDCs, specifically
Sam
talking.
was there as well.
Yeah, right. And theoretically, there was a process getting started via that.
It's the master planning process he just talked about. So it's that will be, for these two areas, that'll be included in these studies. But I know that Wes is having one separately, and CPRD has come before you with theirs, so that leaves us with two remaining.
I mean, I guess even if the CUAB doesn't ultimately set SDCs, I mean, they do kind of advise us on some of that, and so I think it'd be good to maybe have that conversation with.
So yeah, we've had this conversation at a number of tables and a number of rooms with a number of groups of people. Right now, the way SDCs are charged is by door, more or less. If you're building a 4,000 square foot house or a 400 square foot house, you're charged the exact same SDCs. In most states, they call SDCs impact fees, system impact fees, which I think gets to the point more clearly than our very convoluted system, which is that the more impact a development of whatever kind is going to have on whichever system we're charging for, the more they should pay, right? I think it's pretty clear that the people living in a 400 square foot house, probably just one, maybe two, are going to have a lower impact on virtually all of the systems, whether it's roads, sewers, water, whatever, certainly stormwater, than somebody living in a 4,000 square foot house. And yet, our system of charging does not reflect that. And as such, the cost for trying to build more affordable housing that is not subsidized affordable housing, but housing that is affordable because it is smaller, just straight up.
ADUs.
Like ADUs, like cottage clusters, even row houses and triplexes and fourplexes, things like that, were per unit basis. Now, when we start to get into some of those, you get a slightly lower charge because there's a different charge for multifamily than there is for single family. But it still doesn't get to the level of the differentiation that really exists in the impact of those developments. So we've proposed and proposed and proposed and proposed that there be some kind of a scale, right? You are charged your SDCs based on whatever, square footage, based on construction costs, based on number of toilets if we're doing sewer SDCs, based on, whatever, so that there's some relativity to what's being built and what we're charging. Because right now, if you go to build an ADU, depending on what street you're on and what its current condition is, i.e. sidewalks and whatever's supposed to be there, you could end up getting a $40,000, $45,000 bill from the city before you've even pounded a nail. And that kind of tends to cut back on people willing to do things like SDCs, which, as we know, is a really inexpensive way to get somebody housed, relatively speaking, as opposed to, another house on another lot. So I've tried this at MPAC, trying to get the whole region to think about this. I've tried this
and
at
that
C4.
didn't have...
Everybody sits there in the meeting and they go, yeah, that makes sense. And then off we go into our daily lives and
Nothing's carrying, okay.
So
You should go to the LOC training.
I'm not sure what it's going to take to actually have somebody somewhere do something that actually starts to address that issue. As we all know, at least as many, if not more, of our SDCs are controlled by the Clackamas County Commission as we control. But at the very least, the ones we control should be on some kind of a sliding scale, a scale that is appropriate to the amount of development, the amount of impact that's occurring on the systems. I guess I can leave it there. I mean, it's...
That sounds fair. And we can bring that up tomorrow. We're meeting tomorrow, so
Cool.
we can see where that gets in the process of our realm. But yeah, it certainly makes sense to consider the size and impact of development and cost.
A couple of additions. One is that I sent out an email yesterday inviting several of you to go to an SDC conversation with LOC. So Justin and I are both going to go to that, and we're going to have some follow-up conversations with all of you afterwards, just about where we think we can and can't be based on that information.
Some of council is going to,
Absolutely.
I'm going to go, I know.
No, and I'd love to have you guys there.
Expect others would be also.
The second piece of that is that if we reduce the SDCs in one place, we have to increase them in another. So I just want to make sure that everybody is cognizant that whatever we do in development, there is going to be increased pressure on our infrastructure. So we'll be doing it both directions.
Well, and I think it's an important point to be made, even though, that $40,000 figure the mayor quoted isn't just SDCs. Our SDCs are in the $16,000 range, and they're actually among the lowest in the region. They're about half of what they are in Happy Valley, and half of what they are in Oregon City. But they're still a big bite for people.
Well, and we're doing a study right now on ADUs, cluster homes, and we're coming back to you probably in the next 3 months with more information around this and how this has played out in some of our developments. The mayor received a sneak preview on some of that when we held that first meeting with staff, just to understand what the fees were and how those are playing out for these developments. But I think that it'll be a good eye-opening experience across the board, and we are continuing to have this discussion with Wes and our other partners as they are having discussions about their own SDCs. Thanks.
I have two really quick questions. One is a question. Yeah, actually, I guess they're both questions. I wonder if the word citizens sometimes bothers me because even in the code, we don't require that someone be a Milwaukee citizen to have a voice on this board or be someone appointed to this board. And I just wonder if you're meeting tomorrow and in the course of this year, if you might.
Sure.
Council thinks that's appropriate to consider maybe a community utility advisory board or whatever the board thinks would be appropriate, but just based on what our actual code says are the requirements, you don't have to be a Milwaukee citizen.
Okay.
I was also wondering where the 50, I was just kind of wondering, and maybe we'll talk about it more, but I was wondering if we had, I don't really see it in the report here, about the 50%, I assume the revision is a reduction, generally speaking, from revise the current 50% low-income discount to a fixed dollar of $5.
So we'll get into that
Okay.
during that
Great.
presentation. So there's, some different options there on how we're doing things.
Perfect.
So, yep.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments on this portion? Cool.
Thanks, Jake.
Well, let's move
Thank
on
you.
to the water and
Thank you.
wastewater cost
Thank
of
you.
services. And so are you going to be able to stick around for the second
Yeah.
half? Cool.
I'm trying to adjust my chair, maybe they're too high.
Yeah. They were all really low.
Flip through that. So, good evening again. I'm Peter Passarelli, the Public Works Director, and this afternoon with me, I have Dan Kasbaum with Utility Financial Solutions, and Dan's the rate consultant that we've been working with on our water and wastewater utilities. So what Dan's been looking at is he's gone through a couple steps, and tonight's one of the steps in the process. We've gone through and we've done a financial projection for both of the utilities, a 5-year projection looking at our expenses and revenue requirements for those utilities and identified where there were shortfalls in terms of revenue projections. Revenue requirements. And then from there, we also took a look at the current structure that we have for rates and looked at the cost of services to serve the different types of customers that we have. We've got the residential and commercial and larger scale industrial customers, and we took a look at those different customer classes for both the water and the wastewater to see if the cost to serve them were we getting the appropriate amount of revenues from each of those different customer classes to capture the cost for us to serve those customers. That model that Dan used is an AWWA model, industry-wide used model that identifies where you have those shortfalls for those customer classes as well as where you might be overcharging for customers. So Dan went through and did that, identified those shortfalls and over-subsidizations, if you may be, and then from there developed some potential recommendations from that cost of service study. So the next step would to be to have the discussion about the different recommendations, get feedback from council, and then the next point is to develop a rate design for each of those two utilities. So for a 2-year rate design that takes a look at how do we charge our fixed component on the water side, how do we charge our commodity component for the water, and then on the wastewater side, we've got the fixed administrative billing component, we've got a treatment cost, and then we've got a commodity cost. So we wanted to look at those different pieces. So those are the different components to that rate. I think Dan will cover this, but as we went through the study, it was from the financial projections, we're actually in very good shape financially on water and the wastewater. The revenues or the rate recommendations, increase recommendations on the water were 0% for the next 2 years. And then on the wastewater side, they were 2.5% for the next 2 years. And being in that good financial shape provides us options on how we want to develop what we want those rates to look like. One of the things Dan identified during the study was the assets that we have on the water are roughly between 40 to 45 to 50.
They're about 50% on water.
50% depreciated. And then on the wastewater, a little bit less than that.
40 to 45.
Around 40 to 45. So that means we've got relatively younger assets out in the system. That also provides us flexibility on how we want to make adjustments to our rates. And the depreciated, those assets, if they're at a higher percent of depreciation, would mean that we need to replace those sooner than later because they're older and aged. We've been working through over the years and making adjustments and replacements to a lot of those assets.
So I guess I thought our wells were mostly old. I mean, I know we've been replacing one, we're in the process of replacing one, right?
And we've identified, we've made those improvements, we've captured the improvements to the wells. We do have a project that we're doing in well number 2.
Yeah.
So those are projects that are captured in our CIP and captured in that aggregate of the depreciated assets.
Okay.
So Dan's got a presentation. He's going to walk through the financial projections, the targets that he looked at as he was looking at the financial projections. He's going to talk a little bit about the cost of service and then look for some feedback from council on what direction we want to go through for rates, specifically, on looking at low-income rates, looking at our residential rates, and as well as those commercial and industrial rates. Because of the shape that we're in, we have options there on how we set that rate structure up. So the next step, after we get the feedback, we would come back again at a later date with the rate structure, what that actually looks like. Is that pretty much captured, Dan?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I'm going to turn it over to Dan to start off.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me here tonight to go over the results. As Peter mentioned, your utilities, the water and wastewater, are in financially in good shape with some minor adjustments. But I'll get into some of the cost of service areas that we could look at potentially adjusting when we get into the rate design. Is this just okay. So what we'll go through with each utility is we'll look at a 5-year financial projection, taking your revenues and expenses, projecting them out 5 years with no adjustments, and I'll look at 3 key financial targets that we do these studies around the nation, and we've been using these key financial targets to identify how healthy the utility is. And that we'll look at your debt coverage, a minimum cash level, and an operating income level. So we'll look at how those targets are developed in upcoming slides. Then we'll get into cost of service results and looking at how the various classes are possibly overpaying or under contributing to how they utilize the system, okay? And looking at how the system is built, what determines the various costs that are involved with the utility. And please feel free to ask questions as I go through this too. Okay.
Thank you.
Doing a 5-year projection, you got to start with assumptions. First, we use general inflationary increase of 2.5%. Now, we also utilize your financial budgets and projections from the utilities. So with the water utility, the personal services expense there had a slightly higher adjustment compared to the 2.5. So we kind of utilized what you're currently using there. Annual growth of 0.5%, as well as investment income, 0.5%. Growth of volume, commodity.
How much water we're using?
Yes.
Okay.
How much your customers, yeah.
How much our customers are
And it
using.
wouldn't be necessarily what we see around there today, because appliances, just everything is becoming more and more efficient. The average commodity per customer is likely coming down, but then you have some growth, additional home here and there. In general, 0.5% is conservative. You're recognizing some growth, but it could be potentially 0 if you're built out completely, and 0.5% is very conservative. You may see more than that.
Okay.
Just something to keep in mind, we built, both the studies are based off your fiscal year 2017 financial data. We start with audited financial data, so because we get into the weeds and we want to make sure we tie out with your audited financials. So that was the last audited financial statement at the time we did this, and we're projecting your fiscal year 2020 from there, okay? In water, we had a rate increase in fiscal 18 of 5%, so I recognize that in this projection, and also for this fiscal year, you had a 12% increase, and those increases were, what I'll say, across the board. They were to both the commodity and the fixed meter charge, that they were both adjusted up by those amounts, okay, that percentage. And then on the far right is the capital plan that is currently included in the projection. So you can see that 21, there's some larger capital in there. I believe there's a Harvey Street, larger project there that kind of winding that one up. But overall, there's about 500 to 800 just on your average capital plan. And as Peter mentioned earlier, going through the study, it's nice to see you've been maintaining your assets over the years, and this shows that you're adjusting rates as needed. That helps. That's why you're in financially healthy condition right now. So here's a 5-year financial projection. You can see in the middle are your expenses and revenues. I'll first, you can see the highlighted columns, debt coverage ratio, and this is looking at no rate adjustments throughout all 5 years. You have no debt in the water utility, so that's not applicable here. On the further right, we have your projected cash balance, and most of those are all in green. Now, we're comparing that to the far right, the recommended minimum cash balance. I will get into how we identify what that number is in an upcoming slide, but you can see in just 21 and 22 is where we're a bit below that recommended minimum. Good to see you're maintaining a pretty healthy cash balance there, and that helps the operation run day to day, and we'll look at that. The next target we look at, the last one, is the adjusted operating income. So this is the difference between your expenses and revenues, and you can see in 2020 we're well above what the target is there, and I'll talk about how that target's developed. But what that's showing is we're collecting a little more than what our utility costs are, okay? But you can see how that starts to change through the years. So out in 2022, we were falling below that target, and we continue to fall. So we're going to want to look at something to address how far we want to allow that to go down. And it's a balance with your cash position too, okay? So we'll take a look at that. Any questions with the 5-year projection? So here's what, and Peter mentioned it a little earlier, 2 years with no adjustments. So that's helping that over collection kind of come back to where we need it to be. And then in 2022, we would look at a potential of a 2.5% adjustment over the next 3 years. And then you can see how your cash is staying above when you get out there further. It doesn't address those 21 and 22 so much, but I feel with your capital plans, you're not too far out of spec there. Our operating income comes back to where we're turning green, and we're within some reasonableness of our target. So that's a really good position to be in. So one of the recommendations is going to be no rate adjustment in the next 2 in that rate design for water. So the first financial target, we talked about operating income target, and when we talk about operating income or rate of return, we kind of think, well, that's really not, we should be cost of service and not have a rate of return, but really this is a break even for the utility position. So the first thing we look to collect is the interest expense on any debt. That does not apply with water, but we'll see that in the wastewater utility. The next is we're looking to collect the inflationary increase on the assets that are involved in our utility. So if you have an asset today that you put in place, it cost $1 million, you're going to collect depreciation over the next 20 years or whatever the life is. You're going to collect that $1 million back. But it's going to cost more than $1 million when you go to replace it, because there's the inflationary increase each year. So your assets in the ground are more valuable each year because they're costing more to replace as they go on through life. So it's that inflationary increase that we're looking at collecting. So the construction cost index is about 3.2%. But this is a calculation based on the net book value, so you're about 50% depreciated. So the system equity there of 6.1% is the inflationary increase of the net book value, okay, where you're at. So that comes up with about $806,000 as your target operating income.
So I have a question in there.
Yes.
Cost of construction at 3.1 or 3.2. Is construction of water systems so very different from all of the rest of the world that it's in that realm instead of the 14-15% cost of increase that we've been seeing for any new building?
This is based on the Handy Whitman construction cost index. It's a, they kind of like, well, they have certain assets that they look at each year. And they have, Handy Whitman does one for water. They do one for electric, those different utilities. And they track how those assets increase each year. So building is, I'm not sure what Handy Whitman would have on that.
So I think, though, would it be, so that's more of a nationwide average, that cost?
Handy Whitman is nationwide.
So, so do we ever, is there ever a point where you use a more regional cost indexed?
For replacing your pipe, you're probably going to pull that from, I guess you're going to get quotes and such. So I don't know. That's something we can discuss on adjusting, but it seems like it's a little different than a building, but because you're putting pipe in ground that the city owns, you have the right-of-way for where those pipes are under your roads or where they sidewalks. So I'm not sure what's driving the 14% on buildings.
Subcontractors predominantly.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But
yeah, this is looking at probably more the asset, the pipe and the components of the system. You got lift stations.
tariffs aren't changing. I mean, aren't we putting steel pipe in these days?
I'm sure you have steel, yeah, for water.
We use a variety of, I mean, it's ductile iron pipe or HDPE or PVC. There's a variety of different materials that we use.
And we're looking at, in general, that's the Handy Whitman this is the overall summary of all those different kind of components and materials that are used in the system.
Okay.
Okay. Any questions any further questions? Now, the next target is minimum cash reserve, and it's great. Your utility does have a reserve policy in place, but I'm going to look at it in a little different way. What we do is we look at 4 or 5 different risk components, and they're not all risk. In your case, 3 of them are really working capital for the utility to operate, okay? And then there's 1 based on risk. So the first one is O&M, less any depreciation expense. We want to look at your annual O&M, and we're proposing you use an allocator of 12.3%, and that equates to a 45 working capital day, working capital lag, meaning you incur an expense, and by the time you bill the customer, recover that revenue, it's about 45 days. And so you need to have that cash in your available for your operation to just maintain O&M. The next one we look at is historical rate base. This is where we look at the risk of your assets that are buried in the ground for, say, some catastrophic event may occur. You want to have cash available to get repairs going underway right away. We're not looking to fund a catastrophic event, but have cash available to get repairs going while you look at how you're going to finance whatever it is you need to fix. But you want to focus on getting customers connected as quickly as you can. So we talked about your assets being about 50% depreciated in the water department. That's nationally the average. Your assets are not newer, but lower risk of damage. And what we have is a 1% risk factor on that. So we take your historical investment of assets and we multiply it by that 1%, and that's the $260,000 that we're looking at putting in your cash account that you have available to get repairs underway. If you were 70% depreciated, your capital costs are going to be higher every year. You're going to have an emergency fund. So we bump that anywhere from 2 to 3%. Debt service payment, you don't have debt in the utility, so that's 0. And then the last one is another working capital. We look at your 5-year capital plan. We subtract any proposed funding that you might look at debting or borrowing for some of that. We subtract that out. But we need to have, we look at 20% of your 5-year capital plan to be in your cash account so that operations can be paying those bills as they're coming in and being completed. So I just highlighted there 49% depreciated on your assets, but we sum all those up and we come to your minimum level of cash reserve at 2.3 million. And you're projected to be just over 3, so you're meeting that. Off on the right, down at the bottom, your current policy says 50% of O&M. And that is, it's nice. It's a pretty easy calculation for finance to identify what it needs to be. My recommendation there would be to consider increasing that, because you're likely not considering the capital needs and then the potential event that you might need cash. In this calculation, I'm kind of grouping them, but they're not intended to be, oh, we have this much for that, we have this much in for whatever event. It's really, in general, to have that amount available in case it's needed. So to get the policy that you have written to about where we're at, it would increase the 50% to about 75% of O&M. That'd just be a more simple way of looking at it. But keep in mind, your capital plans change throughout time, so it could vary from time to time.
Because that's the number that we're used to seeing in our budget process, right?
The 50.
The 50.
Yeah.
And that reserves, when we talk about reserves, it's a percentage of. And so rather than have the budget documents show these other categories, you're saying, rather than put all that in our budget documents, to just say, let's go with 75 instead of 50.
Simplify it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
But here you have some background of how you came up to that number.
75, right.
Just pick it out of the air.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Don't get me wrong, it's great you have one. That's a great start. So, so that would be something to consider going forward.
So if I can just add one thing before Mark starts on this water cost of service piece. So, one of the things that we had discussions about at the CUAB, and I also had discussions, not with Mark, but Dan, was our council goals, our housing affordability goals. We talked a little bit about climate action and those goals as well, and how what we're trying to do here is part of making sure that we have affordable housing for the community and the role that our utilities play in providing those services. I mean, you could have, inexpensive housing, but have really expensive utilities, and we want to make sure that we try to avoid that. So Dan's gone through this model, and the recommendations that he has on here are based off of the model. And as I mentioned earlier, we're in a good shape where we have lots of options that we can do on how we want to structure the rates, and that would be that next step. So Dan's going to talk about how the model turned out.
Yeah. So on cost of service, or financial projection wise, we're looking good. In cost of service now, we are going through a process that is used throughout the nation. It's a procedure utilized by American Water Works Association. And when we run through the various, you have various meter sizes. And I've assigned residential to 5/8 and 3/4. 1 inch could be a mix of larger homes and commercial. And then when you start getting into 2, 3, 4, you're getting into the commercial customers that require more volume of water. When we look at the overall cost of service, which is in the middle there, the 4.2 or roughly 4.3 million, what that number is after we take and put all your costs, looking at what's variable, what's fixed, and what's related to the size of the meter. The 2.7 million is how much it costs the utility to to provide service to that meter size of customer, and so on down the line. Next to that is the revenue that is projected to be collected using the same billing units and the same rates that you have in place here today, okay? So when you look at the two, you see the residential customer class is looking at just shy of a 2% reduction to get to cost of service. 1-inch commercial, they need a little more of a reduction, 9.5. And you see as the meters are getting larger, the reduction needed is a bit more overall on the revenue side. But you can see then you get into the 3 and the 4-inch, and it's a little different. It's looking at how they're using the system, okay? And there's efficiency of how they use the system. If they drive high peaks, if you're building infrastructure, that's when you put pipe in the ground, you're building it not on what volume is flowing. It's how much capacity is the potential that's needed to go through that line. And you're looking at your meter sizes that are connected there. If you have a number of 6-inch meters out there on a line, you're building that line, that main bigger, as opposed to a bunch of 1-inch lines. So all your infrastructure is sized on those potential capacities that you may have to provide. They also do look at then you have to look at what the average is too, but so that's how we're looking at fixed costs and variable costs. Variable is the flow, how much water is needed. But overall on the bottom, the overall change, and remember I said that target operating income was higher than where we needed to be. That it's about a 7.5% overall reduction that would be needed to get to cost of service. I'm not recommending that here today, but cost of service is a snapshot in time where that 5-year financial projection is more of you see out to the future.
And that 7.5% reduction is in the usage charge and not the fixed cost charge, or it's a combo of the both?
Combination.
Okay.
Yeah. Combination of that and all the different various customer types.
Right.
Yeah.
So just, I want to be clear that I understand this.
Yep.
When you say minus a percentage change, in order to match our revenues with the calculated cost of service, we would reduce what we're bringing in each of those categories by that amount where there's a minus, and we would increase it where there's not a minus, which is only one category.
Correct.
By 30%.
And that's just a snap, as Dan said, that's a snapshot in time, right?
Not a recommendation.
And I think your 6-inch commercial there's one customer on that, so it kind of skews the number. And I don't think they're a typical 6-inch kind of customer. I think they have a meter that's probably oversized for what they actually use.
So, am I understanding correctly that, except for residential, that the cost of service exceeds the revenues in all of the commercial?
Except
In all the rate classes.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
No, vice versa.
Right.
Revenues
Projected
exceed cost of service.
revenues are higher.
Revenues
than
are higher.
Okay.
Cost of service.
Well, except in 6 then.
Yeah.
Except the 6-inch commercial hydrant.
Yeah.
Or commercial, which is 30%.
Projected revenues. But still, residential pays for itself.
All
little
of them
bit
pay
more.
for
They're all-
themselves.
Yeah.
They're all paying a little bit more.
And that's why the 29% difference in the 6-inch.
That is, yeah, and that one is
Is it
probably
anomaly?
not right, yeah. But this is what this is showing. It's if we go back to that 5-year projection, I don't know how to read.
So this is a snap in time after
Yes.
a 12% increase last time.
To the 5-year projection. See how the operating income in 2020 is higher than what the target is? That's what we're seeing in that, in the cost of service summary. We're overcharging right now.
Right.
But when you look at the 5-year projection, you don't want to go in and do a reduction today, only to have to increase shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
It does beg the question, what was the calculation? What were we being told? What were the assumptions being made the last time we did this process, where we ended up doing a rate increase of 12%, which was clearly too much, and now we're going to do 0 for a couple of years, whereas 3% a year would have probably been a lot more bearable for a lot of people.
I would suspect there are 2 ways that utilities determine adjustments, and most are basing them on a cash basis. What is my capital that I'm looking to fund? When I'm looking at cost of service, I'm looking at your O&M of the utility and your depreciation. Now, depreciation is a great measure when you're setting rates because your customers are consuming your utility every day. And in a year, you have assets that'll have a depreciation rate, and every year you're consuming a year's worth of life off that asset. So there's a dollar value that's assigned annually to depreciation, and so we include depreciation in determining what the cost those customers should contribute to in that year. And then we add that operating income that we talked about. We add that, the inflationary increase of those assets. Those are the 3 components that we use to determine your revenue requirement, where often it's utility will utilize a cash basis of O&M, what is my debt in for principal and interest, what is my capital plan, and capital, can go up and down. Depreciation is sets a very stable rate projection. Your depreciation typically is just slightly increasing each year because your assets, the value you put in, keep going up. It provides a much more stable rate plan.
So how are we calculating our depreciation? In other words, what are we basing? You have to have something to start from, right?
Yeah, it's in your asset records and be utilized.
So over the period of time that we've been replacing not only clay pipes, but I believe there was one instance where it was wood pipes with steel pipe.
So
We're using those numbers of how much pipe was having to be replaced, and now we're putting in steel or...
yeah, so each of the different assets have a life expectancy. So a well's got a certain life expectancy. One of the elevated storage tanks, those have a different life expectancy than what the pipes that we have underground.
And do different kinds of pipes have different life expectancies?
They do, but they do in general. But typically, we include the life, the pipes underground, we sort of lump together, and that has a 40 to probably 60-year life expectancy. That I think it's spelled out in our budget document of how we depreciate those. So there's a straight line depreciation for different assets that's captured in our fixed asset report. And then that number's aggregated to tell you what level of depreciation that you have. So that was part of it. I think all the cities, municipalities had to go through a GASB process in the early 2000s and capture their assets that they had, their streets, water utilities, all those things, and start to depreciate those assets out and start to capture those those components as part of their assets.
And will the master planning process, like, sort of ground truth those assumptions in any way? Like, do we ever, like, we're doing a project and we look at the pipe and we go, okay, we said 60 years and this one's only been 40 and it's crap, or vice versa? Do we ever ground truth those assumptions in any way?
We're not doing that as part of this. I've done that before, where we've done corrosion control tests on water systems to determine that. But no, I don't have that as part of this, that ground truth piece that you have in there. I think it's fairly typical, unless you have a lot of issues with corrosion in the pipe, that the lifespan of those pipes are less.
But I mean, I assume that we used industry standards on our estimates of life cycle or whatever.
We do. So, and certainly when we tap a water main, we'll get a piece of that pipe, a coupon that you can look at that and see if there's problems with the pipes. So, and we're replacing those pipes right now. We're on Main Street. We're replacing pipes that were built in the, installed in the 1920s. So.
Right. And that was kind of where I was going. So right now we're replacing clay pipes, which I have to assume have a lower expiration date, a shorter expiration date than steel or some of these new plastics. And that pipe was nearly 100 years old.
Well, yeah. It was fully depreciated out.
I'm sure.
I'm Dennis, Finance Director. So in our financial system, we have a list of assets that we carry for
He's
all
probably going to come tell you.
So we have a list of assets for all of our everything that we have in the city. Pipes is no different. There is industry standards. I don't know off the top of my head what that is, but the clay pipes and that kind of stuff, they're probably already fully depreciated because they are pretty old. So those get just calculated within the financials, and we report that every year. It gets audited. So.
Right, I guess what I was trying to get at, because finance is the thing I suck the worst at, I'm not explaining it well. But if we're carrying numbers for the way our system is depreciating, and those numbers are based on a bunch of clay pipes and some wooden pipes that we've replaced over the last 20 years with much more durable materials, would that not then assume that the depreciation going forward is going to be slower, lower, however you want to say it? You're going to have to replace those pipes far less often than you would a clay pipe that apparently lasts 100 years.
Yes, I think.
Okay, so is that in the calculation? And that's where I'm trying to get to.
So Dan's looking at the aggregate of all the assets. We didn't specifically look at each of the different assets and say, this is what we're depreciating that asset. So we've got this snapshot in time based off of the audited financials that we have, and this is how much depreciation we have.
Can you get close to the mic?
This is how much depreciation that we have at this point in time in 2017, and then we project that forward with additions to new capital that we put in. Those are assets that start to get depreciated, but we haven't fine-tuned that number down to that depreciated number down to.
Well, it's fine-tuned to the point that it's audited financials. It comes out of your financial statements, and I've proofed it to those for 17.
So the depreciation schedule is based on the new technology we have in place.
So it's saying those pipes will be in the ground 150 years.
Because all of that is in our audited report, so all of that is the basis for his information. So, for instance, we are going in and meeting with CIS about our bridges and the depreciation on our bridges after we had the pedestrian bridge incident. So we are looking at the most up-to-date on an annual or biannual basis to make sure that those new additions to the system are accurately reflected in our base model. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
So last year and now this year on Main Street, you mentioned we're replacing clay pipes. So is that how much we've replaced?
Technically, we're done.
Pardon?
The clay pipe part is done.
Is done? Okay. Well, so do we update that, the number of feet of new pipe or whatever every budget cycle? Or do we just do it when we do a new master plan?
So that asset gets captured when it's constructed and goes into service and becomes part of the audited financial report.
Okay.
Yes, it's on a regular, ongoing, monthly, not monthly, but quarterly basis.
Okay.
Okay.
So now I'm breaking down what we just looked at into what the cost of service says commodity should be, what the customer or the meter size should be, and then the total there is what we just looked at for dollars. But overall, what cost of service is showing is that your commodity costs, the variable component of your charge, would go down, and your monthly customer or meter costs, the fixed cost recovery, would go up. Okay, so if we look at your residential customer, cost of service shows that monthly charge would be around $14, and the current charge is about $870. Now, this is cost of service, and remember, we were showing we're over-recovering, but you're in a position where what I want to do is look for your direction on how we want to proceed on the next 2 years. Do we want to move towards what this says? And then how aggressive or not aggressive do we want to be? Do we want to get to that $14 in 5 years? Or do we want to say, well, let's look at that over more of a long-term 10 years? We'll adjust that. And then we can look at the commercials also, or the larger meter sizes in the same kind of, do you want to adjust those in a 5-year, a 10-year kind of way? So when I say 5-year or 10-year, it's take the difference between COS and current, divided by that number, and then I would roughly adjust the current charge by that amount. After that then we're going for a revenue neutral overall adjustment. We would then adjust the commodity down for that.
So.
Can I ask a real quick question?
Yes.
Where do multifamily units land on meter and customer type? Are they residential or?
Commercial.
They are commercial? Okay. That's all.
So this that you're about to hear is a conversation that I started roughly 6 years ago when I got on council, and we got our very first rate increase discussion. And at that time, we had samples of what various levels of service were being charged for things. We don't have that today, unless, did you pull the two things I asked you to pull?
I did get the, so typically
Can you get closer to the mic?
I'm sorry. Our largest customer, usage customers, is a 4-inch meter.
And how many units per month do they use?
On average, they use about 2435.
24.35?
2,435.
Oh, 2,435 units.
And then, on average, one of a smaller low-income customer uses about 0.5 units per month.
0.5 units. And, well, and then what is the large user? What do they charge per month?
So
It's That's just the one, that's one large user?
128.80
Yep,
plus
for a
the
4-inch meter.
plus $4 per unit.
The
Yeah.
$3.94, correct. Yep.
Okay.
So where are you seeing, I'm lost. Where are you seeing this?
Current 128.80, 4-inch commercial.
4-inch here.
So their fixed charge is 128.80, and they're paying $3.94 a gallon or a unit for the
Right.
2,400 units.
Somebody want to break out a calculator and start doing this while I continue with my
I've got it.
tirade?
I calculated that. It's about a 2% reduction on the 4-inch meter, going from...
I think you're calculating something different than what I'm about to do.
Okay.
So the last time I did this, and I obviously haven't gotten to do it this time because I didn't have the numbers this time, but the last time I did this, that person who's using 0.5 units a month was paying roughly, I'm trying, and this is I'm pulling from memory, it was either 8 or 10 times per gallon of water what the largest user was making.
So
8 or 10 times, because the base charge was so, actually makes a difference when you're only buying half a unit of water a year. That base charge then becomes a very significant part of your charge, right? So they were literally paying 8 or 10 times what the biggest user was making. And I have been arguing since that day that that is A, not fair, and B, why are individual residential people subsidizing industry?
Yes.
That happens in the electric utility. It happens in every other utility. I don't get to control PGE, but the 5 of us get to control this. I get the concern about, well, if we reduce the base charge and we increase the usage, then we could lose money because we won't be charging enough if all of a sudden everybody starts using less water. So then we charge more. We have a reserve. It's not like the city's going to go into debt or into the red in the period of time it takes us to figure out that all of a sudden everybody's cut back on their water use. There are other cities or other water providers that do it this way, where it is, if they have a base fee at all, it's tiny. And their water use, you literally are being charged on a per gallon basis instead of on the way we are currently doing it. So I would very, very, very much like to see a model the next time we meet to talk about rates that does it that way, that figures out how do we pay for our system, and we're doing it on a per gallon basis, basically. And when it's boiled right down to brass tacks, it's a per gallon charge. So the people using 100,000 gallons are paying for 100,000 gallons, and the person using 1,000 gallons is paying for 1,000 gallons. And it's exactly the same charge per gallon to each of them.
I haven't been on council as long as you, but I've now heard this at least twice.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a recurrent theme.
So I'm not really sure why we haven't
Well,
gotten
and
it.
I feel poor Peter got both barrels this afternoon.
So the presentation tonight is actually for you guys to say this.
Okay.
So it's not that you've been ignored or that staff hasn't heard you, but this is the start of this process where we actually can calculate this out. So I think it's important for him to hear this, but that's why we're here.
Okay, and I just want to it's actually been 3 times. I'm just going to correct myself, 17, 18, and now 19 that I have now heard this. So I think.
So, one of the things I've been trying to do here is, the mayor had mentioned last year, we had an increase, a 12% increase. We wanted to have a little bit more rigor in looking at our rates to make sure what's the appropriate rate we should be charging. You can see from Dan has presented, that it looks like we're over-collecting on all those different customer classes. We're over-collecting on what our needs are right now, which puts us actually in good financial condition and provides us options on how we can make adjustments or design rates and set rates up for the future. And that's really what we wanted to do, is get this feedback from council to see what direction that we wanted to go. And there's trade-offs with those different options, of course, and different rate designs. The more dollars that you try to collect from the commodity charge, the more risk you are to under-collecting based off of use. That rate goes up, people start using less and less water, so you start under-collect. You're not collecting enough to do that, so then you have to go back and increase that cost, so it sort of can step up over time, or it may drive out some of the larger commercial or industrial customers that might be more sensitive, to large.
And they'll have water trucked in? I mean, I know that there's a couple of them that have interties with Portland. And I'm actually going to have this conversation with the Portland City Council.
Yeah.
But other than the people that have interties with another system, they're going to have water trucked in? The big industrial customers, how are they going to go to another provider?
Well, I mean, they may decide that they want to have their business somewhere else.
Yeah, they could move.
Over their water charge.
Depending on the rate.
I don't know.
Well, I mean, that can be said
I don't know.
for
There's
so
a lot
many
of our
reasons, but I
local
think
residents, householders that are thinking the same thing.
You're right.
Because that's probably amongst the top 3 or 4 things I've heard over the last 6 years is how high they call it the water bill, but I realize it's a utility bill, and folks do not understand it. They do not understand the safe charge and the streets charge, and that water is on there, and wastewater is on there, and stormwater is on there. They call it the water bill. But even me, I mean, just a few years ago, I got a bill every 2 months, and it was about $70, where now it's $114 every month, and it's just me. So I can empathize with a lot of these residential places, and the businesses, it seems, get a better benefit than the residential places do. So,
and they are making a profit with that. It's not like you
and my household
are making
is not
any
making
profit.
a profit.
You're just trying to survive. The residents are just surviving.
Yours isn't either.
Right.
We're not.
Those businesses are actually, whatever they're using the water for, whether they're making a product with the water, whether they're using the water to cool their systems, however they're using the water, there is a profit being generated with our water.
Staff's not debating that. What we're...
I know, but in the packet, the recommendation that was presented to us was to adjust the commodity down and adjust the monthly charge up. I don't understand why that even was remotely considered after the 3 times that one of our newer counselors has heard this. And the last time I remember doing this, we were in the fire bay, and all 5 of us, because it was Shane then, said, yep, we should adjust this to do a different system. And yet, here's a packet that is suggesting the exact opposite of what we all said very clearly in that meeting we wanted.
Then I'll own that, and we will make a correction into this next report.
or at least to consider it.
I was going to say, I think we all ask for the options and the calculations. I don't think we all said I want to go 100%
We said living
commodity, and I don't think I would want to go
see
there.
what works the best.
But I do think that this system does not, I mean, there's an inequity, and it does not maximize encouraging conservation.
Correct.
But going all commodity does maximize encouraging conservation, and then gets us in that risky situation of not having enough of a base. So, I mean, I don't think going all gallon, cost per gallon probably makes sense, but I think we should see some different projections about what that.
And to keep in mind also that you had the 0.5 growth potential. As I understand it, right now, either in planning, in permitting, or under construction, right now within the city limits, we have 1,000 new units of housing being developed. That is literally a 10% increase in housing. Now, that doesn't then play out into commercial as much, although we are seeing new commercial as well, because a lot of this is mixed-use housing. So we will be seeing an increase in commercial that is far more dramatic than a 0.5 increase. So I think that also needs to be taken into account. When we worry about not being able to pay for a system, we don't have to change the system much to change our production, correct? It's not like we have to drill a new well up to a certain point. It's not like we have to, there are maybe some mains that have to be replaced, the bigger mains, if we get a whole lot of development in certain areas. But relative to the whole cost of the system, I can't imagine that we're going to have, even if all of a sudden everybody goes, wow, if I cut back, if I put in that low flow toilet and change my shower head and whatever, put in some rain barrels and water the lawn with them, I can save like $20 on my water bill. We're still not going to drop to the point where it's catastrophic. And we can go back then and adjust the rates when we see that. Oh, wow, look, it's come down 20% across the board. We're going to have to adjust the rates to match that. But we'll still be charging at that point, whatever largest industrial customer, the exact same price per gallon as the...
I wonder if either LOC, which sometimes does rate comparison stuff for cities, or the Regional Water Providers Consortium, which I sit at, but we don't really talk about individual city rates. But I wonder if any of those kind of forums would have any information on cities that have tried to shift the balance more and what their experience has been.
So I used to sit on the consortium, and I, of course, brought this up at that, and I forget who it was. It was either Tigard or Tualatin or somebody out that direction that had a system that it wasn't a straight line kind of system for gallons used. It was like this stair-stepped. If you use X number of gallons.
Well, that's Tualatin Valley is the big.
Yeah.
But it was close. It was more equitable than what we have.
We've worked, an example with electric. If we get to where we're dependent on those commercial customers to, support more, to provide more support than others, if they do choose to leave, you'll feel it more, okay? And we have seen that in electric.
I can't tell you how many times I get phone calls from businesses that are desperate to find a place in the city of Milwaukee to start their business. If somebody leaves, awesome, I have a space to offer somebody. I don't think it'll last long.
But then these here are the results of a cost of service. So this is the part that I'm here for tonight, to talk about your financials and your cost of service. And the second part is, and what Peter mentioned, is the rate design. And the fortunate thing you have is you control the rate design component in how we go forward with the rates. I'm showing you that financially you're in good shape.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we know what the cost of service is and how those different ratepayers are playing into that and whatever, but because we wouldn't necessarily know that if you hadn't, done this work. So that's great, but there's kind of this underlying issue.
So what I can do is we'll work together and going forward. I don't know, maybe you got where I just had examples of, where I would suggest you would go, not knowing you had 6 years of what you've been doing, okay? The position you're in, you can definitely give that a try. Our recommendation from cost of service wise is different, but you are you control the rates. So, and what we can do is look at how your current rates are, give some feedback of what you're thinking, and then we can start adjusting towards that. I wouldn't want to do it, we are always advocates of you take small steps. Okay, and have a long 5-year plan on where you want to get to, and then kind of work towards that. And then don't forget about it year to year. Doesn't sound like you will, but you work towards where you want to go. And 5 years goes by quick. So, so these are where the cost of service components come about.
So could we see a, take the two extremes you talked about that you looked up, but maybe also a couple in the middle, like an average house and a smaller business, and show them like what it would cost, what their bill would be if it was all commodity, what their bill would be under your recommendation, what their bill is now, and kind of give us those three, pick 4 or 5 different sizes of user and show us what those would be next time you come.
Yeah, I think we can do something like that, and that's actually part of that rate design piece to show what does, as when you develop the rate, what's the impact to each of those different customer classes. So, I mean, this is just showing the cost of service right here. This is not what Dan's suggesting that the rate needs to be at this time. So the idea was that, we've gone through this study, looked at the financial picture of each of those utilities, reviewed the revenue requirements for those to see where we had shortfalls. And, the water side, it looks like, hey, for the next 2 years, we don't really need to do anything unless we wanted to adjust that cost of service or make adjustments on the low income side to provide a benefit to those customers.
How do we currently charge on the low income? Remind me again.
So on the water right now, we don't charge a fee, a fixed fee for a low income customer.
So what you mean, they don't pay for their water?
No, they pay for their water, but they just pay the commodity.
They pay the commodity,
Yeah.
not the...
And on the wastewater side, they pay 50% of those 3 components, the commodity, the billing, that fixed charge, and then the treatment charge. So they pay 50% of those costs.
So is there any rough idea of what that 50% equates to? I mean, I know it would be all over the board, I would think. I don't know. But I was concerned when I know that's coming up in a slide, and I don't know how much longer we're... But when it said to reduce that only by $5 a month instead of, and I didn't quite understand 2 figures there. But that concerned
We'll be
me.
getting to that slide, and I
you.
can talk to that. Okay. That's the water. So it sounds like what we would want to do is maybe provide those like 3 different scenarios, just a couple examples, and then you can kind of take an idea from there to give direction on where you'd like to go with your residential, and you might have some different direction on the commercial, it sounds like. So whether it's maintaining the residential customer charge and increasing the commercials up to where towards cost of service and reducing commodity, there's a number of scenarios you can do. So we'll have to try to work on identifying what direction we want to do on that. And it sounds like keeping the commodity at the same or higher and adjusting down the customer charges is what I think you're saying.
Whatever, yeah. If it was just me, I would be for dropping the base charge altogether and doing it purely on commodity. There's 1,000 businesses out there that run their business that way, probably 1 million.
Well, it'd be good to know what other cities do, yeah.
Yes, and Peter and I were having this discussion. This is one of those places, just like the way we charge for electricity, just like all of these little things that get real complicated real fast, that when you boil them down, when you look at what is being paid every single time, industry, big business, and rich people win, and poor people lose. Every single time, every single thing you can possibly imagine. And this is one of those places. So if we go out into the world and say, other cities, what do you do? I guarantee you, most of them, it will be the same.
Well, it'd be interesting to know who's tried doing what you're suggesting and what their experience has been.
Sure. Yeah, if we can find some, that would be.
I think we've talked about this already. And on the bottom is where your current monthly customer charges are. Okay, we got through the water. Now wastewater can go a lot quicker because I've already talked to you about targets.
That's never controversial.
Well, because we have no control over most of that, unfortunately.
Yeah, the most part of your bill. So same, we have some assumptions, our inflation. Wes they project a 5% increase. We have that in here. Again, growth, 0.5%. And now those are conservative adjustments. If you have higher growth, it's going to mean you have more revenue. And again, based on 17, and our capital plans are off to the right.
So our current budget year that we're in, we did not make an increase. We had a 0% increase on the wastewater.
5-year projection without rate adjustments. Here, we'll first look at debt coverage ratio because that's a requirement that you are to meet. Typically, you need to be about 1.2, 1.25. We add about 0.2 safety factor for any year or month that you may be with low sales where your revenues drop some. So we have a safety factor there, so a total of 1.4, and you're meeting that with no rate adjustments throughout all 5 years. We're good on debt coverage. So
is debt coverage Wes's debt, or do we have debt for our own collection system?
That's our debt.
That's our debt, okay. Okay.
And then if we look on the far right, the very far right, there's where it shows what percent depreciated you are. You're on the newer side. For assets of around 42%. Our cash balances are healthy in the first 2 years, but you see how they start to drop and fall negative out in 24. So we need to do something to address that. And then in the middle, our operating income goes negative in 2023. So there's it's showing that we need to do something to address that. With a 2.5% adjustment, remember, we have those, our costs are increasing, our West treatment is increasing. With a 2.5%, your cash balances remain positive and at or above the minimum target. Our operating income, we don't get to target, but we're holding our own there at about 600,000, okay? And our debt coverage ratio is very healthy with those adjustments. So with a nominal 2.5% adjustment each year, our utility is forecasted to be in really good shape there. And
that's including Wes's 5%?
They're part of that expense.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Debt coverage, that's the ratio between the cash generated by the utility in the year against what your principal and interest payment is. Just looking at a ratio there. Your operating income, in this case, I talked about, it includes that inflationary increase on your assets, and in this case, the interest expense on any debt. So your interest, you have a great rate of, it's about 0.5%. That's outstanding. And then your system equity is right there around, based on net book value, just under 6%. So a total operating income target of about $560,000. Here in the minimum cash, I kind of went through that with water. Looking in at the same thing here, newer assets, we calculate a minimum cash reserve about $2.5 million. Your current policy says 25% of O&M. I would recommend that go to about 35%, just to keep it simple. That is generating about, when you look at the minimum cash target in a day's working capital, it's about 124 is where the target's coming out to. Your bonding agencies will typically look at days cash on hand. But overall, really good. And here's, again, the cost of service. Overall, looking at the residential needs an increase versus the larger commercials. But overall, 1.4% adjustment to the utility for that test year of 2020. Now, we're going to be looking at a 2.5 because we're looking at 5 years out. So again, here's where we'll have to look at the full commodity versus where we're at today. But cost of service is showing that your customer charge today on wastewater is just all straight one charge. But the various meter sizes identify how you're building your infrastructure. And remember, the assets that are involved in an infrastructure, you have depreciation, and that's a fixed cost. And that fixed cost is being recovered the same here for a residential as a large commercial. So we want to recognize the difference in fixed cost recovery from a larger use customer versus a smaller, and I say use, a smaller meter customer versus a large meter customer, that there's capacity differences there. So really those commercial customers should have a larger customer charge, and you see that in the cost of service. Like for the 4-inch, it suggests a $60 monthly customer charge for them. So something we'll look at in the change is looking at potentially creating a different monthly customer charge by meter size, or no meter cost at all, and all on commodity.
Don't we have different, I mean, I know Wes talks in terms of EDUs, and so they have a flat EDU charge, but then they characterize businesses as X number of EDUs, so it's not like they're really charging them all the same as a household.
Correct. And you beat me to it.
Oh, okay.
The far right is the EDU for the treatment.
Okay.
That's your treatment. So you see it's $31, your current charge for the West, and it's $67, $66 on those larger commercials. Cost of service is just generically, it comes out at $37 on average. But because they set that price signal to your customers, that's why you have that difference there.
So do we charge differently for commercial? I know the way we charge for sewer for residential is we meter what they use in water from whatever it is, November to March or
We don't anymore.
October
we do.
through.
Oh, do we?
Yes.
Yeah, we
Okay.
still do.
So we don't count summer rates of
Right.
water usage, just winter rates of water usage, and we assume that all of that water is then going into the sewage system year-round. How do we calculate for commercial? Is it similarly?
The commercial customers are, it's not that annual average, it's not the average use, winter usage.
It's just straight.
It's the straight usage, and then the EDUs are proportionally charged based on how much they use.
That probably makes sense because there's probably a whole lot less irrigation that, unless they're a golf course, and we don't have one.
And volume-wise, for what a commercial, well, some commercials don't use as much, but the larger commercials, the irrigation is pretty small if they do have it compared to the manufacturing.
The rest of their use.
And so we talked about, an overall 2.5% adjustment. We'll have to get you some ideas of where you want to look at for rate design, whether it be all commodity or some scenarios with adjusting the customer charge or the meter charge. And the note on the bottom, we talked a little bit about what that fixed adjustment. It was just an option that sometimes what we see is for low income qualified customers, that you give them a fixed straight dollar discount. Yours is a 50% discount. So their discount actually grows every, through time as your rates adjust up, their discount grows also. So with a fixed dollar discount, and this is something I just wanted to bring up, a fixed dollar discount of, say, $5 on your meter charge. As your meter charges go up, it remains at a $5 discount.
Mm-hmm. But the low income, believe me, their income doesn't go up.
Yeah, every dollar counts.
Every dollar makes a huge difference. I mean, a huge difference.
This is something I wanted to just mention, but by all means, it's up to you to make that.
Is there any problem administering the 50%? Is it complicated for billing or anything?
So I think what happens with the 50%, so if there's an interest where we're charging towards moving towards the cost of service, when you have the 50%, things get out of alignment. Mm-hmm. So I think that's
over time.
So if you don't have the interest to move our rates towards the cost of service, then that's not important to do.
So I'm interrupting a conversation because I do want to go back briefly before we leave here about my concerns about going to purely a consumption-based rate. And I was not eloquent before, so I'm going to work on it here. We are based solely, we hire a lot of employees, and we set our budgets based on what our expected income is. Those employees are based on, we have to have a certain amount of collection. I can't pay for water employees out of the general fund. That's not how we function. So if we have a really high rain year, and people don't use a lot of water, and we are entirely consumption-based, and we have a dramatic reduction in how much people use, we don't have enough money to pay for our employees. So part of why cities have some base income is to assure that you have some money coming in even as you see a reduction. There's a secondary piece in this, which is if you have a major business that is 10% of your water use and they leave, maybe this isn't why they leave, but they leave. And we don't have somebody who comes in even using that much water again, and we've gone entirely to consumption-based. Even with the replacement of the use of that building, we will be reducing our staff levels in order to make up the difference for the loss of revenue. That can happen in a 6-month period. That's not something where we're coming back every 6 months in order to adjust the rate.
But I don't understand why, if there was this giant emergency of we're going to have to lay people off, we couldn't come back and say, oh, we're going to have to raise the rates.
We will be coming back a lot because what you're talking about is a very volatile system where it is entirely dependent on other people's actions that will hit whether or not we receive sufficient revenue for payment. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying we can't come up with a far better system than what we have presented to you today.
Some kind of hybrid system.
And I am planning on doing that. I have heard all of you loud and clear. We will be coming back to you in this rate structure with that. But before Dan leaves here with this understanding from all of you that an entirely consumption-based model will work for us, I needed to let you know that will add a volatility that will be very difficult for me to manage into our utility structure. So I wanted him to hear that from me, and I also want your response back to him so that he has a little bit more understanding about what you're expecting of him.
So when you project this most dire of very rainy summers, or the loss of, and I don't think we have a single business that uses 10% of our water. I think it's probably more like 1%.
You have two very large business, and I've asked Bonnie and Alma to go back and to look at the uses of those businesses in particular so that I have a very strong understanding of what happens if those businesses leave. Mm-hmm.
So.
And I think climate change is real, and I think that doesn't mean drier. It means less predictable. And so for me, I do think that there is a possibility that I will end up with high rain years where people are less dependent. We will also go into drought. So I'm not questioning that either. There will be years where we see skyrockets, but it's hard for us to manage the system within our levels when that volatility also exists. So I want to make sure that Dan knows I also need to function as a department for at least 6 months. I can't have that amount of extreme volatility.
Right, so this was where my question was going. So
Please.
I'll finish that question now. We have a cash reserve of what, $3 million-ish in this particular thing. Do you imagine that in the direst of soaking wet summers, combined with a business leaving, that there would be a $3 million fluctuation in the amount of money we're bringing in?
I believe that in volatility, my bond rating starts to get hit, and I start having some issues. Sorry, I'm looking.
I would just like an answer directly to that question,
So
please.
we have a $3 million, roughly a $3 million cash balance, but some of those dollars are associated with capital improvements that we've got planned that are in the works, projects that we've identified to construct, to replace infrastructure that we have right now. So if we didn't have that money on hand, because we pay as we go, we're not borrowing to provide for those improvements.
But we just talked about a reserve amount. Maybe I'm misremembering, I'm mixing numbers, but we talked about a reserve amount that is for the instance of when something very bad happens, being able to start to fix those very bad things.
You have a rainy...
Calculate until we can get the loan or whatever to
Absolutely.
Solve the problem.
We carry reserves to assure that in a crisis, we are able to cover that. Absolutely, and I don't disagree with that. If it looks like our rate structure is routinely bumping into those reserves, we will be, what I was saying with the bond ratings, we will show that we do not have stability within our financials. And that starts to hit me in other places. I think that this is an incredibly smart and kind policy direction that you're going. It's not a comment on that. It is me asking that you guys also consider our ability to function as a department through the ups and downs of the system as we are finding a better way for us to address this issue. And we will come back to you with a better way that better meets your expectations. But I needed, because my response before was not articulate, to explain why there has been concern and reticence from staff. And it has nothing to do with thinking that residents should pay more money than commercial. We will find a solution to that.
Is there a way to explore an approach to rates that allows for a bigger buffer, a better sized rainy day fund if we were to increase our volatility and with, I hear you on not wanting to jeopardize our bond rating.
I think CUAB technically in the past, and I would turn to them, but they have been cautious about us carrying too many reserves because it also looks bad to our residents when we are charging them rates and they don't understand why, if we have all this cash sitting over here, why we're now asking them for more money.
Absolutely.
It's a delicate balance.
I've heard that.
But I think that it is a fair question, and I think that so I've done this namely on energy side. I haven't done this as much on water as we've been trying to figure out renewable rates and the fluctuations associated with renewable rates. So just full discretion or transparency, I guess, that I don't know water as well. But that is why there's been decoupling of sort of your base transmission rates and how you handle those set costs versus the cost of buying and selling energy.
Right, but there are assumptions that get built in. So when that happens, and I've heard the argument, I've heard it straight out of the CEO's mouth, that it costs us more to get that electricity to all of those houses than it does to this one factory. Got that, I understand that. However, that is putting all of those human beings in a class, in a category, and then doing that calculation. if it was a true straight-up calculation, it cost us X to get electricity to you, then the little old lady whose house is right beside the power plant would pay very little for her electricity, and the industry that's 100 miles away would pay more, and then the house that's 1,000 miles away would pay more on a per. But that's not how we do it. We lump all the people together, and then we do that clever calculation about how it costs us more to serve the residents. And that's what I'm talking about, that I think it's a gamed system because the people with the money have pushed the system to be what it is.
And I'm not questioning the rates that you pay, that we end up charging per unit of water. I am talking about you also are going to have a base rate that assures some semblance of stability within the system. So we're going to look at how we have a conversation about residential versus commercial. I'm all for that. I'm just saying I can't completely decouple the need for us to provide base level service across the city entirely from how much water you use. So we'll come back to you with, if you guys want us to look after we do those calculations and we come back with rates and we don't do it right, we can keep going. But we have to come up with some stability within the system just so that we can budget. And then there's going to be some flexibility in there about who pays what. And I think that is really the concern you've had, is making sure that we are not placing this on the backs of people who have less. So we're going to try and fix that. I'm making sure that I'm really clear on camera that I'm also going to try and make sure that we have a guaranteed level of service. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are over by a lot. We have moved our conversation with Denny to the regular session.
Okay.
So we have a break. But is there anything else, Dan, that you felt you needed to say?
And what I can do, and the cost of service has other components that I can provide. What it costs to bill a customer, what it costs that are fixed, that don't vary. If they buy zero commodity, the utility still incurs this cost to have them a part of the system, right? So I'll be providing those kind of base costs. The other part we talk about, if there's a under recovery of revenue on a high commodity cost rate design, if you have a drought, you're going to significantly overcharge your customers because they're going to be using a lot more water. So it can go both ways. I just want to, something to keep in mind there.
We will continue this conversation. It is not the end.
Thank
we
you.
will have Denny.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I just wanted to, just one further comment. So,
But wait.
So let's not forget the good news. So, you know, what Dan has said in our analysis is that we don't need to increase our water rates.
Yeah.
Right? That's good news.
That's great news.
And the wastewater rates, there's a minimal increase, 2.5%.
Also
So
good
I think
news.
that's
Right. It's
good
certainly
news
not
that we're
14%
overlooking. So, you know, how we package and how we design those rates are important, and that's why we wanted to have this discussion to get feedback from council, because we didn't want to provide, you know, here's what the rate needs to be. We want.
I'm cutting him off because you have 8 minutes. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing us back to a positive place, Peter.
Yes.
Peter, are we adjourned?
We are adjourned. And for whoever's watching or cares, we will probably be 10 minutes.